Last time on Issue at Hand, Crisis on Infinite Earths, DC Comics' first line-wide reboot, was enacted in order to streamline the company's decades-old multiverse into one simple storyline. And it worked. Mostly. For a little bit. But you know what they say, when you give a 50-year-old multiverse a reboot, you're going to have to give it another reboot in order to fix all the problems the previous reboot created. Today, on Issue at Hand, we explore the post-crisis patch history of the DC Universe through Supergirl and Powergirl. They're not the only superheroes who struggled to find a new origin story after the crisis, but they're the only ones who just kept getting tangled up in the DC Universe's multiversal origins. Let's start with Powergirl. Introduced in 1976, Powergirl is the Supergirl of Earth 2, the parallel Earth that's home to the Golden Age Justice League, the Justice Society. Kara Zor-El is Superman's cousin who, like Superman, was sent to Earth on a rocket as Krypton was dying. And after the Crisis on Infinite Earths, pretty much everything about that was a problem. For one thing, Earth 2 no longer existed. It had been folded into the main timeline of the DC Universe, and all the classic Justice Society characters were now an older generation of superheroes from before Superman formed the Justice League with Wonder Woman and Batman. It wasn't just Kara's world that didn't exist anymore. Her Superman didn't exist. And that's where it gets tougher. One of the biggest editorial changes made after Crisis on Infinite Earths was the mandate that Superman should once again be the sole survivor of Krypton. So, Powergirl's new origin story had to disconnect her not just from Earth 2, but from Krypton entirely. So, DC made her... well, they made her the granddaughter of an Atlantean wizard, and he put her in suspended animation and gave her the memories of a Kryptonian refugee because reasons. Supergirl, on the other hand, had a simpler problem. She was dead. Nobody in the new DC Universe even knew that she'd ever existed. But fans remembered. And only a couple years after her death in Crisis, a Supergirl was back in the DCU. But how do you give those fans all the qualities they loved in Supergirl when you can't make her Superman's cousin? A good Lex Luthor from a doomed pocket universe created a shape-shifting life form out of protoplasmic matrix and sent her to our universe to recruit our Superman to help. This Matrix wound up being the only survivor of that pocket universe, and Matrix Supergirl's early adventures were characterized by her uncertainty about how she fit into our universe. She even believed she was Superman for a while. But eventually, she settled down with a nice young man. Lex Luthor's mind in the body of a clone of himself who was pretending to be his own son. Eventually, even DC itself realized that Crisis had created some problems that needed to be emphatically resolved. Problems like, is Hawkman reincarnated Egyptian royalty? Or is he a space cop from a bird planet? Thus, 1994's Zero Hour, a story about Hal Jordan attempting to destroy all of time itself so that he could restart the Big Bang and mold all of history into the best of all timelines. Jordan couldn't be stopped before the timeline was rejiggered a bit, which was the excuse writers needed to restate what was canon and what wasn't. Unfortunately for Supergirl and Powergirl, Zero Hour was not used to give them better backstories. In fact, the extent of Powergirl's involvement was to give birth to a baby that her wizard grandfather had impregnated her with. That baby grew up real fast, fought a demon, disappeared, and everybody agreed to never mention it again. Supergirl wouldn't get another major change to her status quo until 1996, when Matrix merged her form and consciousness with a dying girl named Linda Danvers, transforming her into a literal angel? Merging with Linda gave Supergirl many of the same qualities of pre-crisis Supergirl, like a secret identity and human parents, but her backstory was still just way too complicated. In 2004, almost 20 years after her death in Crisis on Infinite Earths, Matrix/Linda Supergirl was quietly retired, and the no extra Kryptonians rule was relaxed. Kara Zor-El, cousin of Superman and survivor of Krypton, arrived on post-Crisis Earth. And just in time for Infinite Crisis. Infinite Crisis was a 2005 miniseries honoring the 20-year anniversary of Crisis on Infinite Earths, and it's where post-Crisis Powergirl finally got her mojo back. Let's rewind. Crisis on Infinite Earths said a great big goodbye to Earth 2, the classic original DC universe. This meant saying goodbye to the granddaddy of the entire superhero genre, Golden Age Superman. At the end of Crisis, when it seemed like Superman and Superboy would be trapped in the bleak antimatter universe for the rest of their lives, Alexander Luthor, the son of a heroic Lex Luthor who put his baby on a rocket to another universe just before his was devoured by the Anti-Monitor, created a pocket dimension utopia for all of them to live in. They even brought Golden Age Superman's true love, Lois Lane. In Crisis, this utopia dimension was pretty heavily implied to be heaven, which was a fitting farewell for the very first superhero. Infinite Crisis revealed that Superman, Superboy, Lex, and Lois had been watching the post-Crisis Earth ever since, and they weren't happy with what we'd done with it. Superman, Lex, and Superboy bust out of their utopia dimension intending to restore the multiverse and scour its infinite timelines to find the perfect version of the DC universe and destroy all of the others. And while they're at it, they recruit Powergirl, restoring her memories of Earth 2 and giving her back her original, simple backstory. No magical underwater creepo granddads necessary. Infinite Crisis was a story that asked really interesting questions about how DC's universe has changed in tone over time, and what that might say about the narrative needs of America and the world today compared to what we needed from our heroes in the past. It was also a story where Superboy literally punched the space-time continuum so hard that it brought Jason Todd back to life. When the dust of Infinite Crisis settled, Powergirl was from Earth 2 again, and not long after Infinite Crisis, the year-long Series 52 culminated in an event that restored the DC universe to a finite multiverse of 52 parallel Earths. But with reboots in 1985, 1994, and 2005, I'm sure you've guessed that this status quo didn't last forever. In fact, it lasted just a few years until 2011's Flashpoint, in which our old friend Barry Allen tries to use his speed powers to go back in time and prevent his own mother's murder, but in doing so, mucks up the entire future of the DC universe. And as he literally races to set things right, Barry sets things different. Ma and Pa Kent died before Clark ever became Superman. Barbara Gordon was still Batgirl. The Justice Society had never existed. And for everyone in the DC universe, that's just how things had always been. This wasn't a patch. It was DC Universe 3.0, the New 52. And after years of post-crisis troubles, Supergirl remained Superman's cousin. And even though Earth 2 was a little different this time around, Powergirl was still Earth 2's Superman's cousin. But here's the thing about big comic book universes with long-standing continuity like DC and Marvel. The sense that every character exists in a larger interconnected world of stories is a big part of what gives those universes, and the smaller stories inside them, the potential to be so special. But that continuity can also be incredibly intimidating to new readers. I've been wrapping my head around DC Comics and, to a lesser extent, Marvel continuity for about 20 years, and I had to read a bunch of comics and wiki articles just to make this video. So believe me when I say that you can enjoy superhero comics without knowing every detail of their universe off the top of your head. Continuity should never drag a story down. The purpose is to make it feel grounded in a wider universe and a longer history. So if reading a comic makes you feel lost, then it's just not doing a good enough job. There are plenty of comics out there that use their continuity powers for good, and I'm going to show you as many as I can. Next time on Issue at Hand, and all of the next times on Issue at Hand, characters you need to know, writers and artists you need to read. Comic books that do a good job.
Didn't DC just reboot again?
Yeah, it's called Rebirth. We don't really know what's going on with it yet because it's not over.
So what do we know then?
The reason that the DCU is so grimdark is because Dr. Manhattan from Watchmen ripped 10 years out of the timeline from its recent past without anybody noticing.
Reasons?
Yeah.